farming can be hard, and farming can be really discouraging. There are times, there's a lot of variables that we as farmers deal with constantly that are out of our control, and it can be very frustrating when things aren't going well. And I think it's really important to keep it fun. We have to find things that are interesting to us and that stimulate us mentally, because if we just keep doing the same thing every year and hoping the situation will adjust to us, how likely are we to find success?
Welcome to the 318th installment of Ear to the Ground, the Land Stewardship Project's podcast on family farming, regenerative agriculture, community food systems, and local democracy. I'm Brian DeVore, editor of the Land Stewardship Letter. When taking steps to build soil health, it's easy to have high expectations for what's possible. Why not? After all, seeing what a soil health rock star like Gabe Brown has done to build resiliency and productivity on the land is truly inspiring. In fact, many pioneers in the field are seeing significant improvements in soil health within 3 to 5 years, which is impressive, given that for decades soil scientists were convinced that raising organic matter levels, for example, was all but impossible in a typical lifetime. So it's not surprising that when Minnesota farmer Mike Seifert started on his soil health journey around 2018, he had high hopes about the potential impact of practices like no-till, cover cropping, and the integration of alfalfa and small grains into his corn-soybean rotation. Indeed, he did see a major increase in aggregate structure, which has helped reduce erosion and has increased his field's ability to manage moisture. He's also been able to reduce what he spends on chemical inputs as a result of the practices he's adopted. But Mike concedes that he's been disappointed not to see the actual biology of his soil a lot further along by now. It turns out there's a difference between building a solid house for the soil biome and stocking the pantry with nutritious food. Creating a healthy soil biome with a good balance of vibrant fungal activity can create fields that are more resilient in the long term, and which have the ability to cook up their own fertility and become resistant to weed and insect pests. After taking microbiologist Elaine Ingham's Soil Food Web class, Mike became convinced that he needed to kickstart his soil's microbial life by applying compost extracts. So, for the past 2 years, he's been making his own compost extract on his family's farm in southern Minnesota. Working with the Sustainable Agriculture Research and Education Program and the Soil Health Coalition, Mike's been experimenting with utilizing homegrown ingredients to build compost piles and then distilling them down to a liquid extract that he applies to the fields utilizing modified tillage equipment. It should be made clear that applying a compost extract to spark microbial life is different from making enough compost to cover an entire growing area, something gardeners are quite familiar with. The idea with compost extracts is to create a biological inoculum that sparks a kind of soil microbe chain reaction. As a result, a little extract can, in theory, be used to treat a lot of acres. Mike isn't the only farmer in the region experimenting with compost extracts. Currently, the Land Stewardship Project is working with 5 farmers, 4 in Minnesota and 1 in Wisconsin, to research the effectiveness of the Johnson-Su compost bioreactor system. Developed by soil microbiology experts David Johnson and Ho-Chun Soo Johnson, this system also strives to develop fungal-dense compost piles which can, in turn, produce soil inoculants. There are some significant differences between the type of composting Mike Seifert is practicing and the Johnson-Su system, but the goal remains the same. Both methods are trying to hack the soil's biology and kickstart it into a more self-sufficient system. The Seifert family recently hosted a composting field day that the Land Stewardship Project co-sponsored. After he took participants step by step through his composting system and led them on a tour of the fields he's been applying inoculants to, Mike sat down to talk to me about his disappointment in discovering that building good soil structure is not enough, and how he's working to supercharge his biology as a result. He also reflected on why hands-on research like this is a fun part of being a farmer.
Without going too far back in our farm history, just a quick idea would be, it was a full-time dairy farm until 1993, and then my dad sold the cows, and he kind of part-time farmed it, growing corn and soybeans from 93 until about 2017 or so when we started talking about soil health practices. And then it was 2018 when we started doing no-till and cover crops. And 2019 was our first year our first full year where we really were devoted to the no-till and cover crops concept. And then since then we've diversified our rotation a little bit so that we're not doing just corn and beans anymore, but we also include a significant portion of our land in alfalfa hay, and we usually have at least one field of small grains every year. We are not, dogmatic adherents to the no-till concept, but we try to keep our tillage as minimal as possible so that we only use it when we really, really need to. And all of our corn and soybeans are pretty much no-tilled. We might do a little tillage when we do establishing a field of alfalfa hay, like with a brilliant seeder where you need to prepare a little bit of a seed bed. So we're pretty devoted to the idea and soil health principles, and we're trying to implement as many of those principles as we can. And we use cover crops. In terms of after corn and soybean harvest, we plant cereal rye. We plant green into rye the next year, and we interseed our corn crop with a diverse mix of cover crops as well, with varying degrees of success depending on the drought conditions. The last 3 years have been pretty droughty, so for us, that interseeding has been a little hit and miss, but we keep doing it because it's a really good concept, and we really feel strongly about taking that monoculture corn crop and turning it into more of a polyculture crop. So,
and you've kind of introduced small grains a little bit into the mix with the alfalfa and everything.
Yeah. We use small grains, either oats or winter rye. We've done both now, where we've grown oats that we will harvest and then clean and direct market them for horse feed as bagged horse feed. And then we've grown winter rye. This year we grew winter rye as our small grain to be cleaned and sold as cover crop seed. Probably going to go back to oats next year, so we're just kind of figuring out what works best for us. But I really like a small grain as a precursor to an alfalfa crop. And we've gotten our alfalfa rotation to the point now where the intention was when we used to grow alfalfa, we might have one field and we might grow it for like 5 years, and so a fairly long rotation. Now we've gotten to where we have 2 alfalfa fields. They're on a strict 3-year rotation. So after 3 years, a field gets terminated, and then it goes to corn the next year. We spray it down in the fall, and then no-till corn into it the next year. But in that same year, we've established a new alfalfa field after small grains fall seed the alfalfa. So we've always got 2 alfalfa fields in various stages of that 3-year life cycle, and that's been really great as a precursor to corn. We can follow alfalfa with a corn crop and grow a really nice corn crop that's fairly weed-free, no-tilling into that alfalfa field that's being taken out of production, and we can provide a lot of the fertility needs for that corn with that alfalfa field too, so we can keep our fertilizer costs down. And one of the biggest things that I like to use alfalfa for, and it's also a really good cash crop. We've found that doing small square bales of like high quality horse hay that we sell to horse customers has been very lucrative for us and has now formed about 1/3 of our farm's income. Part of that has been the dry years, too. We've been able to make really good quality hay. So that's important, I think, from a financial perspective. And then a weed control perspective. Having that alfalfa in the mix gives us a chemical-free way to control weeds. If we have a particularly weedy field, we will sometimes slate that as the next field we're going to establish with a small grain crop and then an alfalfa crop. Because let's say we have a field that's got a lot of glyphosate-resistant ragweed or water hemp or other broadleaf weeds that are problematic. That 3-year alfalfa rotation will really knock out those weeds because they never get a chance to go to seed. And then we can have multiple years of really low weed pressure corn and soybeans after that. So it really does a variety of jobs for us, and has been really, really, really beneficial to get that rotation away from a strict corn and soybean rotation and incorporate the small grains and alfalfa to have that perennial, to have the small grain crop. I should say too, with oats are a good mycorrhizal fungal carrier. So having that oat crop in there is kind of the reason we'd like to go back to that again next year, doing oats rather than winter rye, because that gives us a chance to get hopefully some mycorrhizal fungi inoculated into our soil through that oat crop. And that's kind of the best way I found to do that so far.
Well, one of the things that kind of got you on this soil health journey was you had learned about what folks like Gabe Brown were doing in North Dakota, and that got you really excited, and you started integrating cover crops and no-till and some of these things you talk about. But what struck me was you realized maybe fairly early on that those practices you were seeing you saw some benefits pretty quickly. So, reduction in erosion and the aggregate structure was improving, but you weren't seeing the improvements in the overall soil health that you would like to see just from purely those practices and kind of, I guess, building that soil house, you realize you had to kind of work on the inner workings of it a little bit and the biology of it. You talk a little bit about that. Sounds like that was a real eye-opener for you, that there was more to it than just maybe making sure that ground's covered 365 days a year or making sure there's good root structure in there and all of that.
Absolutely. So I'll preface it by saying maybe my expectations were unreasonable, but but you hear from a lot of guys, you hear from a lot of people implementing soil health practices that 3 to 5 years you're going to start to see dramatic results. And maybe it's just human nature that we talk about dramatic results, because we want other people to adopt these practices, and there's no reason other people shouldn't. So I don't mean to downplay it, but what I found, I took the soil food web classes with Dr. Elaine Ingham, and that was a big investment to do that, but I really felt like I needed to understand the biology in our soils so that we could kind of understand what sort of progress we were making, because we could see results above ground, of course, and we were early in the process, so we hadn't started to see those results yet, and that's kind of why I wanted to take those courses when I did, because I'm like, let's find out where we're starting from and where we're going to. And when I started to do microscopy work on some of our soils after those courses, what I realized was that we were 3 years into no-till and cover crops, and we still had soils that looked very bacterially dominated. The structure was improving. I think our water infiltration rates were improving. We were seeing good results with our crops were kind of coming around after a transition period, and so we were getting decent yields. And we were reducing our fertilizer use and a lot of good things. And spray, our spray usage was going down, so like we were cutting back on a number of things and hoping that the biology was going to pick up the slack. And what I was observing was that we just did not have that diversity of biology in our soils quite as quickly as I was hoping. And again, maybe I was being unreasonable about that. They say 3 to 5 years, and I thought at 3 years, things were going to be looking really good, and I was a little disappointed. So then that's what got us on track to start making compost. So having taken those soil food web classes and then having looked at our fields and seeing that the biology was not where we wanted it to be, part of those classes was learning how to make really good, high-quality, biodiverse compost. And I thought that was kind of just a nice addition. I wasn't that interested in the compost portion of it. I just wanted to understand the biology and be able to do the microscope work. But then when I discovered what I was seeing in our fields via the microscope, I realized maybe we could start to use that compost to inoculate those soils and try to bring more of that beneficial biology back to our soils quicker and accelerate the process. And maybe do it in a way that added more microbial diversity. If we allowed it to come back on its own, it probably would have over a longer period of time. But I thought if we started making compost and then turning that compost into extract, liquid extract, and putting that on our fields, we might be able to pick things up, speed the process up, and see results quicker and have more diversity because we're going to bring things into that field through the composting process that might not just happen there on their own through no-till and cover crops alone. So that was kind of the philosophy behind why we started doing that. So we're 2 years into that process. We have a grant through SARE, and we're working in partnership with the Minnesota Soil Health Coalition on that. The grant period is 2 years, and it's going to be ending this coming spring of 2024. But I'm going to continue to do that beyond the actual research period because I'm seeing some benefits. It's a little bit nebulous yet in terms of results, and I think that's normal. It's a scientific study. It's certainly not hurting anything. We've had some results through soil tests that aren't really showing a whole lot of uptick in biological activity, but I also think I have some more work to do. Like, my composting process is not totally perfect at this point. We're getting better at it as we go, and we're learning a lot as we go, and we've developed some pretty neat little pieces of equipment to help apply that biologic extract onto the field that we can continue to use. So I'm not giving up on it, but I think it's important to iterate that we're not seeing really dramatic results yet, but I think we're seeing some results in our field from it.
And you took us through, it was a really good step-by-step of your process a little bit, and wonder if you could, you don't have to go into major detail, but explain a little bit what some of the material you're using and how you're it's a recipe that you have. There's a method to the madness a little bit, and some people may be familiar with the Johnson-Su system, which is something where you keep it in a stack undisturbed for a year sometimes or more, but you're using your timeline's a little bit different and it's a little bit. So maybe explain the difference between that and sounds like you're kind of doing it in windrows, that type of thing. It's a great setup. You've got the old dairy barn there, which you explained. That was always the source of your fertility on the farm, and now it's kind of ironic that it's another source of, I guess, soil health for you.
Yeah. So we lost our dairy barn in 1998 in a storm, and it now is the concrete surface. The floor that's left there is where I make the compost that I'm using for this process. I think the most important point is, whether it's similar or different from that undisturbed pile, is that we're making it with a purpose. The ingredients that we pick for the compost are very purposeful. We're trying to make compost that's very fungally dominated, because our first goal, I think, we're trying to restore the entire web of life in our soil, and that's a lot of different microorganisms. But probably the most important balance that we're focusing on first is that ratio between bacteria and fungi. So we're trying to make compost that's very fungally dominated, and whether that's active fungi or fungal spores in the compost, that's really what I want to be applying to our soils. So yes, we don't do exactly the Johnson-Su process. It's more like, I guess you'd call it the soil food web method, where we try to pick ingredients that are high carbon ingredients and make that the majority of our compost pile, or at least more than half. That's what majority means. I guess I had it right. So I like to use things like wood chips. We have a lot of buckthorn on the farm, so when we're cutting that down in the pasture, we'll run that through a wood chipper. That's great for introducing a fungal component to the pile. We have straw here. We raise broiler chickens on pasture, but they spend some time in a brooder coop, so we always have wood shavings and chicken manure that we can use. We have some goats here that are helping browse brush in our pasture. So I have a shelter for them, or a trailer with straw in there, and they like to go in and they create a lot of manure. And that straw mixed with manure is a great ingredient for us for like fungal component in our compost mix. So we like our compost to be about 50 to 60% kind of that high carbon, hopefully mixed with some kind of manure that brings in, more biology to the mix. We try to use as diverse a mix of ingredients as we can when we make our compost batches. And then it's about 30% green grassy material. So I'll use meadow grass a lot of times. We bale meadows, and we'll have a bad bale here and there, or something that just isn't, acceptable to sell, and I'll mix that in. There's no shortage of sources for ingredients on a farm for making compost. And then the high nitrogen component that we use to heat up the pile, because it's a thermophilic composting process where we want the pile to get hot, and we're going to turn it a couple of times to get everything through the hot middle of the pile. And then we're going to let it sit for quite a while. So after the thermophilic process, it's a lot like the Johnson-Su process, where it's going to spend a decent amount of time just sitting as a static pile and letting the fungi develop. But I was saying, for a high nitrogen component, since I don't have manure on the farm, I don't have a lot of livestock here, except for the incidental stuff mixed in with the high carbon ingredients, I'll use alfalfa. Alfalfa is a really good high nitrogen ingredient that helps get a pile nice and hot. And we want it to get up above 130 degrees, but below about 175 degrees, somewhere in that range, to kill off any pathogenic bacteria and microbes, and weed seeds in the middle of the pile, and so on. So that's kind of our process in a nutshell, where we go through that hot thermophilic process. We'll build a pile using those ingredients, kind of in that 60% browns, 30% green grassy material, and then 10 to 20% high nitrogen. That's kind of our ratio. No matter what ingredients we're using, we're trying to hit those ratios. And then that usually results in a pretty decent result. We get a good pile that gets hot enough to do what it needs to do. We get it through that hot phase of building the pile, turning it a couple of times, and letting it sit. And then we can basically let that pile mellow and age for as long as we need to. And we sort of assess that by looking at it under a microscope. We'll make an extract or take a sample from the compost pile, and we'll examine it under a microscope and see what life forms we have there. And then we can kind of decide if it needs to sit a little longer, or if it's ready to use, and so on and so forth. So that's kind of the brief Cliff's Notes rundown of how we make a pile.
You feel like sometimes you'll have what you need in about 3 months or so. Is that right?
Yeah, so in the soil food web classes, they'd talk about what I just described and say, like, you can have finished compost within 30 days. That always feels a little bit too fast for me, and so with some of the ingredients we're using, they're not breaking down quite as quick if they're larger ingredients and stuff. So I tend to say that we've got pretty good usable compost within about 3 months, which is nice, because if I can start a pile at the beginning of summer and I want to do a fall inoculation, I can have material then for putting an inoculation out on our fields by that fall. And for my spring applications, I use the previous year's compost. So if we're doing things right on a decent schedule, which oftentimes we're not, because things get busy on a farm,
Right.
But in a perfect world, we can keep that cycle going, so we always have a good supply of compost. So what we do with that then is we take that and we brew it into an extract. And I like to talk about the difference between an extract and a tea, because people hear about compost tea, and those two terms are often interchanged with one another. So by saying we make an extract, I guess what I'm saying is we take the compost and we put it in a mesh, like a tea bag, a 400 micron mesh bag, and we steep that in water in a big, those 275 gallon IBC totes that you can buy on Craigslist or Facebook, and lots of people have them for sale. And we have an aerator system in there to keep the water aerated and mixing. And it takes us about 30 minutes to make a batch of compost extract. And all we're trying to do really is pull the biology out of that compost mix and get it in that liquid solution. Because then we can load it onto an applicator and take it out into the fields, and we can cover a lot of ground with that. The difference would be if you're making a compost tea, you'd be brewing that for, you'd maybe steep your compost in that water and add a food source, and you'd be brewing it for a longer period of time, say 24 to 48 hours. And you're trying to multiply the microbes and really build up a really dense microbial population in a compost tea. And then you have to get it applied really fast because the population density in that liquid is so heavy that it'll use up all the oxygen really quick if you can't get it applied. So we're taking the safer route, I would say, where we're doing this extract mix where we're just pulling the biology, getting it in the liquid system from the compost into the liquid water solution. And then from there, we have some equipment that we've modified to be able to apply that out in the fields. We have our corn planter, which is set up basically like a liquid fertilizer delivery system where we can load the compost extract in and it injects it right in furrow with the corn seed. That's probably my favorite way to apply the extract because it's putting it right with the crop seed, right where it needs to be, and hopefully giving that seed a shot of biology that will then develop as that plant grows and continue to affiliate and associate with that plant root system as that corn is growing. But we have also taken a chisel plow that we used to have to do tillage work, and we took the chisel, the plow shanks off of it that were used for turning the soil, and we put thin anhydrous knives in their place so that we can go in without doing too much soil disturbance, and we can inject that compost extract about 3 inches into the ground. And that's nice for more of a blanket application. Our corn rows are 38 inches apart, so when we do extract with the corn planter, it's pretty spaced out, but it's going right where the corn needs it to be. But with this chisel plow modified as an injector, we can space those. Those shanks are running about 11 inches apart from one another, so we can get a more blanket coverage with that. So we've got a couple of different tools that we've put together that we have at our disposal to put that biology right in the soil. And to me, that's a really important part of this.
Yeah.
An easy way to do this process is to make an extract and put it in a regular crop sprayer and then surface apply it with your sprayer. And you can cover a lot of ground that way, and I think it's a good, viable way to do it if you don't have any other method. But I look at it as the biology is created in a compost pile. It needs to go in the ground because that's where it's going to be most at home. If you put it on the soil and plant surface, you're going to have UV rays, you're going to have air drying out that compost. The biology is not going to thrive if you put it out in a hostile environment that it's not acclimated to and where it wasn't fostered to begin with. So that's a big part of what we're doing too, is trying to get that compost extract right in the ground where it's going to do the most good.
And what's really neat about this is it's kind of punching above its weight in that you are able to take a relatively small amount of material and create an inoculant that can cover several acres. And your ratio, is it like, was it 10 pounds or 10 gallons? Maybe explain that. Math is not my strength. I had that written down. But anyway, explain that ratio of how much you're applying per acre. And because you explained earlier that if you were composting enough material to cover your entire farm, like it was a source of fertility, I mean, you'd have to have a huge composting operation. It wouldn't be tenable for you.
Yeah, and that was the appeal of the liquid extract, because we felt like we could cover a lot more acres with that and use it as a biological inoculum. I mean, I think maybe, a lot of home gardeners, who get compost, they'll blanket their garden with 4 inches of compost, and that's great. It's a wonderful way to do that, but it's not feasible on a farm-wide scale. I was kind of explaining it, I remember when we had dairy cattle, and we'd haul manure all winter long, and there was no way we'd cover all our acres, so the idea of generating that much compost. So the idea, I think, it's a paradigm shift in a person's mind where you're not imagining blanketing your fields with a thick layer of this stuff, but but more the idea that you're putting it out there as a biological inoculum, you know, and you're putting enough out to introduce the biology and give it a little bit of a kickstart, and then from there, hopefully it takes off on its own. And maybe there's a niche that certain species that you're fostering in your compost pile will then get out into your fields and find a way to thrive. I said it's kind of a shotgun approach where we're trying to create as much biology and as much diverse biology as possible and put it out there, and then hopefully whatever is best suited for the field situation is what's going to thrive, and then other things are going to die. But maybe in subsequent years they do better. You know, every year is different and every situation is different, and hopefully our soil is changing and evolving as we go through this process. And so it takes, I think, some persistence and some patience and consistency.
Yeah. What was it again per acre that you
Oh,
were
right.
kind of
So I got off, and
you've got to correct me on that.
so the rates. I don't have it in my head, but we can let the listeners do the math. So I use about 20 pounds of compost to brew up 220 gallons of extract,
Okay.
and then from there I apply 10 gallons per acre. That would be that's my application rate.
And there is a method to the madness in that you do microbial examinations, and you're trying to get a certain amount of microbial activity. It was something like, yeah, explain that. It was 300 to 600. But
Yeah.
anyway, there's a goal that you're looking for. It's not just you are a little bit letting nature take its course and draw out of that what it wants, but you also have a goal of you feel like you need to attain a certain level of microbial activity there.
Right, and that's a tricky thing to do because you have to kind of pick a marker that you want to use to indicate, you know, how heavy of a rate am I putting this down? And you can mix it in any concentration you want, and you can apply it at any number of gallons per acre that you want. So honing in on a number or a method that's going to provide the right benefits is a little bit of a challenge. And I know the first year that we applied compost extract in the spring, we set up. Well, I should backtrack a little bit. The marker that I've decided to use is fungal spores because we've been pretty successful at making compost that has a lot that is fungally dominated. I don't see as much other biology in there as I'd like protozoa and nematodes and things like that, but I think we're getting better at it and we have room for improvement. So for now, with what we're doing, we have been able to get good fungal compost. So what I will do is mix a batch of extract, and then I will pull a sample from that and look at it with a microscope, and I can count fungal spores under the cover slip of that microscope slide. And then we can multiply that out. You know, we know how many, one drop on a microscope slide, and I know it's 28 drops per milliliter with the pipettes that I'm using. And from there, it's just multiplication out to gallons and gallons per acre. And the first year that we applied compost extract, we put on about 6 million fungal spores per acre. And that's the marker we've chosen to use. Because fungal spores are easy to identify under the microscope, and they're easy to count. And those are things that, and they help forward our goal of getting more fungi in the soil. So that's kind of how we came to that, using that as the marker. And then we went to, actually, it was an LSP event in Lewiston. I think it was at the Pangrac farm, if I have that name right.
Yeah.
And Dr. David Johnson was there. And I at one point after he was done speaking, I kind of pulled him aside and told him what we were doing. And I said, what rate should I be shooting for? And he said, about 50 million fungal spores per acre. So we knew he had come up pretty short on that first application. But it's a learning process. So after that, we increased our concentration of brewing, how much compost we used to brew a batch, and then how many gallons per acre we were putting down. And now we kind of figured, since it doesn't hurt anything to go over the recommended amount, that we're somewhere in the neighborhood of 300 million to 500 million fungal spores per acre, and sometimes a little higher than that. It just depends. But if we can hit, at that point, we're so far above what Dr. Johnson recommended, and I'm kind of using him as the benchmark, that we're not too concerned whether it's 300 million or 500 million. You know, we're in very safe territory for the amount of biology we're putting down. So that's kind of how we determine our rate. So it's a learning process, and you have to try it and correct your mistakes and keep going and get better.
Well, I like that idea of you are, again, working with nature, so you let nature kind of decide, maybe even from season to season or field to field, what it needs from that extract and using it. But you're not completely letting nature take its course. You have certain goals and markers that you're going for, because you have to have some guidelines that you're working under. Otherwise, it's just a wild west out there. So it seems like that's a good balance.
Yeah, absolutely. And we can see some results. It's been tricky. I have to be honest, we've had 3 years of drought, and that has colored our results, I think. because it's hard to grow microbes and microbiology in the soil without moisture. And so we've been doing this for 2 years, and we've been dry for 3, and I would really love it if we could have a what might be called a typical year, so that we could actually give this a fair shake and see if the benefits are there to the degree that we'd like them to be. And that's why I'm going to keep doing it. Eventually, we're going to hit a year where we get more rainfall, and we're going to see that biology do whatever it can do under ideal circumstances. And you know, today on the tour we went out, we looked at some soybeans that were flourishing and doing better in an area where we'd applied compost extract versus right next door where we had a control zone. But it's hard to say. In farming there's a lot of variables, and so we're playing it by ear, and we're learning from our mistakes, and I hope we're getting better at it. I'd like to say, you know, as I'm making compost, the biological diversity of the compost we're making is not where I'd like it to be. So our next step is going to be trying to take our finished compost and feed it to earthworms and make vermicompost. And in that way, I think we'll get a more diverse, higher quality product that we can use for extract. And then the bulk compost that we're making could maybe just be applied on the soil surface in fields. So we're trying new things even within this process and trying to correct things and make it better as we go.
In general, I know that you're still trying to figure out what the ultimate results are going to be, and every year is different, and you're looking for, like you said, a typical year. But it sounds like it's just plain fun. Kind of learn. You are a natural learner, and you are learning a lot about what's going on, and you like fiddling with the equipment. It looks like you know how to hack equipment, but you really like hacking the biology. I can tell.
Well, you know, Brian, I think farming can be hard, and farming can be really discouraging. You know, there are times, there's a lot of variables that we as farmers deal with constantly that are out of our control, and it can be very frustrating when things aren't going well. And I think it's really important to keep it fun. We have to find things that are interesting to us and that stimulate us mentally, because if we just keep doing the same thing every year and hoping the situation will adjust to us, you know, how likely are we to find success, you know? So it's like, I hope I'm not disillusioning myself, but I feel like I'm stacking the deck in my favor, you know what I mean? If we can go out and we can learn about the biology, and that's one more element, maybe we still can't control it 100%, but we can influence it more than if we didn't understand it at all. And we can know what to look for to know at least that aspect of our farm is something that we're working on and that we can see and that we can measure in some way. And it just gets put into that pot of things that we do have control over, or at least we know something about. So for me, it's a way to remain optimistic and remain hopeful. And I love the idea that we could be an example to other people who are looking for answers on some of these things. If we can figure out some of these mistakes and figure out what works best, that's the point of this field day today. It was like, we can pass on what we know so far, and I hope in the next few years we learn a lot more, so that if we have this field day again in 3 years or 2 years or next year, we can say, hey, we made some breakthroughs, we have some answers now where we're getting good results here consistently. That's really important to me. I feel like we need to be a part of making a difference.
For more information on the Land Stewardship Project's work with compost extracts and other areas of soil microbiology, see the podcast page for Ear to the Ground episode 318 at landstewardshipproject.org. If you have comments or suggestions about this podcast, contact Brian DeVore at bdevore@landstewardshipproject.org, or you can call 612-816-9342. By the way, it helps us greatly if you can give Ear to the Ground a rating on whatever podcast platform you utilize. Thanks to Laura Borgendale, a Western Minnesota musician, for Ear to the Ground's theme music. And a special thank you to all of Land Stewardship Project's members who make initiatives such as this podcast possible. If you're not a member, visit landstewardshipproject.org to learn how you can support LSP. Thanks for listening.